And we're back with Emma Knows Money and Stephanie Anderson. And we are talking about estate planning. And we're going to talk about young families, kids, and money. And, you know, when you're in the industry, the financial industry, when you're in the legal industry, you're always going to have horror stories about things that happened that was unexpected. And one of the stories that I can bring up is a young family, and the husband passed away. He had an aneurysm at a very young age, in his mid-30s. And he had named as the beneficiary of his life insurance his wife for half of his life insurance and his firstborn child as the second half of the life insurance. Now, he had 2 kids, but he hadn't updated it. So what issues do you see that scenario causing?
2 major ones. Obviously not accounting for the other child.
Right.
The other one is what we talked about earlier, right? Is that, you know, once we give a life insurance policy, we just name a beneficiary, we've lost control over how that money is used. And when we name a minor as a beneficiary, now the court's got to step in, right? Because we have someone who's not old enough to be able to manage that money. They're not an adult yet. So now the probate court is getting involved with an asset that normally life insurance is something that they wouldn't have any type of control over or jurisdiction over. So now they have to get involved to make sure that that money's protected until that child turns 18. And that costs money.
Yes.
Right? That
you have to
costs
have
money.
the right lawyer.
Yeah.
Because I think it was like federal court that you have. There's some type of circuit court that you have to go in front of. And
Yeah, it's
depending on the
probate in
insurance
Georgia.
company. Okay.
And it'll be the probate court that would have to set up this conservatorship for this child until this child turns 18.
Right. And there has to be an executor. And one of the downsides of that is if the other spouse needs that money, they legally cannot touch that money because now it is set aside for that child.
Exactly.
And, you know, to your point, the second and third child are completely legally left out, and you cannot divide that money up.
Exactly.
So one of the common mistakes we just talked about was people naming a child under 18 as a beneficiary. What are some other common mistakes you see when people look at naming legal guardian for kids? And then if you can go into maybe explaining the difference between having an executor and a legal guardian for the kids.
So that's actually one of the biggest mistakes.
Oh.
So you have the executor, which we talked about, which is the person that's going to be in charge of distributing the assets to the beneficiaries according to your wishes in your last will and testament, right? And you have the legal guardian who you appoint in the will to raise your children if you can't do that.
Okay.
So one of the major mistakes that I see is that sometimes people will say, well, I really want to name, you know, so-and-so as the legal guardian, but she's not good with money.
I get that all the time. I don't trust her with money, but I would trust her with my child's life.
Yeah. So I would say this is my advice. You want to name the best person that's going to raise your child. The finances, that's not their responsibility, right? So we can have one person that's going to be in charge of the finances and someone else that's going to be in charge of raising your child.
Okay. So there can be 2 separate people.
2 separate things, people, and they can work together for the common good of your children.
Okay.
But I never want people to think, okay, my children love so-and-so. I really want to name them, but they're horrible with money. No, that's the right person. You're on the right track. Name that person, but we're going to name someone else to be in charge of the money.
Okay.
And then have them work together for the common good of your children.
So do you have any estate planning tips for young families?
The biggest thing is to have a plan.
Okay.
So many people wait until they, you know, well, let me wait until I'm older. I'm too young to have that conversation. So for young families, the biggest thing is just make sure you have a plan, and it's bigger than the money. I know a lot of younger families are building, so they don't feel like they have enough to plan around. But even if it's just as simple as making sure the person you would want to raise your children is going to be that person.
Right.
Because otherwise it's going to be a probate court or a judge who doesn't know your family, doesn't know the situation, who's going to ultimately make the decision about who's going to be in charge of raising your children. That's the most valuable asset you have, right? So that's the biggest thing. Just make sure you have a plan in place. Make sure you've thought about who's going to raise your children. You've thought about legal guardians. You've thought about who could step up if something happened to your first choice with legal guardians.
So you should go a couple of, so you should go, what, 2 or maybe 3?
Think of at least 1 primary
Okay.
and 2 contingencies.
Okay.
And if you're naming a couple, be very specific. So if you've named husband and wife and something happened to wife, are you still okay with husband raising those children alone?
Gotcha.
Or do we go to your next choice? So be very specific if you're naming couples.
And when you're thinking about that, I mean, not being the Debbie Downer, but a lot of marriages end.
Yeah, that's
and
true.
so if the marriage ends, then what?
Yeah.
So, wow, I never thought about that.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a good, that's
So
a
be
good
very
one.
specific.
Okay, when we come back, we're going to talk about celebrities and small business owners and things that they need to think about from an estate planning standpoint. We'll be back right after these messages.